Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Welcome Michael Nelson from Old Dominion University, who will be talking to us about the Memento project, which is recently launched and is, I think, a fascinating project that we're very interested in and have been watching and been in a dialogue with the group of conspirators here. Michael, I'll hand it over to you to tell us more about Memento.
Great, thanks. Is this on? I think I clicked it on. Am I good? All right. Excellent. So I'm Michael Nelson. And this is the list of co-conspirators that we have. So I'm really excited. One, we even started with a video of Total Recall, right? So we've definitely got the past and future thing going on at the same time. Do you
mind taking your lanyard
Oh,
off?
okay, right. Actually, let's see if I can do this without killing myself. There we go. Well, I'm not completely unhooked. Now I'm really getting. All right, there we go. Excellent. All right. So, as both a Philip K. Dick fan and a Paul Verhoeven fan, that was a great way to start. So who here is familiar with the Internet Archive? Uses it regularly? Lots of people, right? You probably wouldn't be here if you weren't a fan. So that's good. A lot of people that I talk to aren't familiar with the Internet Archive, and we sort of fall into two camps. One, there's the people who haven't heard of it and don't know what it does, and two, there's the people that think that it has every copy of everything that's ever existed. And so archiving is not an interesting problem to work on because, well, Brewster's got it under control, and that's all we have to worry about. So the reality is somewhere in between there. So what we want to do in the Memento project is make browsing the past web easy. We want to leverage the Internet Archive. We want to leverage all the other archives that exist. There's dozens of other archives that are out there. And we want to make browsing the past web easy. So you can go here. We'll see these again. And particularly, to begin with, what we need to do is review the web architecture. So we're going to take a little idea. So the web architecture is really just a couple of things. We have resources. Those resources are identified with URIs. And when I dereference a URI, I get back a representation of the resource. You don't get the resource itself. It's like a platonic form, right? You can't actually touch it. It exists in the ether. I get something back. Now, there's this concept of content negotiation. The idea is it's possible for a resource to have multiple representations, right? The English version, the French version, the JPEG version, the PNG version, something like that. So this is the basics of the web architecture. URIs represent or identify resources, and when we dereference those, we get representations back. Okay, so the idea here is there are resources out on the web, and of course they're interlinked, and that's what makes it useful. When I dereference those resources, I get back the representations. And whenever I dereference it, I get back the current representation, obviously. Now, the idea is each of these resources is changing independently through time. So they have old representation. So you click on it now, and then somebody else clicks on it in 10 seconds from now, and you have different representations. But essentially, we have a perpetual now. Whenever I click on it, dereference it, I get back the current representation. Well, what happens with those those prior representations? Well, we have the current, and the old versions, well, they just get thrown away. Okay? Well, okay, that's a little white lie, actually. Some of them are fortunate enough to be archived. If you're in a content management system like a wiki, then the old representations are actually stored. That's that history tab value. If the Internet Archive or website or Archive-It or any of the other national archives that are all throughout Europe, if they come around, they might hold on to your copy, right? And so the idea is somebody is storing a prior representation. We're going to find out it's at a new URI, but a prior representation of your resource. And that's the idea. We'd like to try and leverage that. So for example, going back and looking at some, one side effect of working in the Memento project, we tend to focus almost completely on disasters because those are the things that we remember. So we have to come up with some more positive examples. But so here is CNN.com. Now, if I dereference that right now, I get back a representation that's whatever's happening today. People in the Netherlands mourning or something like that. But if I wanted to set my time slider to go back and revisit how things were on September 11, 2001, well, that page actually is archived at the Internet Archive, and it exists at this new URI. It's a different URI. Now, you're smart enough to know to go to the Internet Archive, but most people don't realize that for this resource, where I might be right now in my browser, there's an old representation at this new URI. How do I get from this to that? And that's really the key. And even in the Wikipedia, when everything's in the old, stored on the same server, I have this URI, but the emerging page as it was happening, or the first representations of that, those exist at different URIs. How do I get from this URI to this other URI? How do I make that connection from the current web to the past web? Well, obviously, the Internet Archive has a browsing function. All you have to do is plug in your URI and just simply find the one you want. It's easy, right? There's thousands to choose from. So, I mean, yeah, it's possible, but it's not really friendly, right? This is not something you explain to your friends. Similarly, the Wikipedia example has also an intimidating history list, right? But even these two history lists are different, right? We have sort of an ad hoc approach to maintaining these old copies. And it would be nice if we could get away from sort of the manual perspective of this and also merge these in so we could have a uniform approach to accessing these prior representations. So here's another example. When we're in Wikipedia, when you're looking at an old page, so here we are on a page about the September 11th attacks, because Wikipedia doesn't do URI rewriting inside, so I'm looking at this old page whenever it was archived, when I can't find the date, December 2001, and then there's a link to the Pentagon. I click on that, and I don't stay in this December 2001 timeframe. All of a sudden, I'm transported back to the future. Well, I don't want to be in the future. I want to stay in this temporal bubble, this temporal lens I want to view the web with. Similarly, if I'm in the Internet Archive, which does do URL rewriting, so in this case, I'm at September 11th, and I click on, so that's 2036 GMT. I click on a link, follow that. I stay near that same time. I actually shift forward an hour. But in this case, there's content that's missing from the archive. All right, so that was 9 years ago. What if that content, what if these images, some of the style sheets, what if they existed in other archives? So one of the things we're trying to do in Memento is do away with sort of the URL rewriting that keeps you trapped in a single archive and sort of leverage the long tail of archives that exist and see if we can pull content from other sites as well. All right, so the problem statement is the current web that we browse right now and the past web that actually exists, but exists in sort of in a reading room kind of perspective, right? It exists at a special place on the web. You have to go there, visit it. You're not allowed to check out or touch anything or something. And basically, there is no, from the past web, I can find, this was a memento or an old representation for a particular page, but I can't go from the current page, what we view now, back into the past. All right, so what we're trying to do here is make it so we can set a time slider on our web browser, in this case, setting a time slider for October 11th, 2011, and 2009. I bring up a Wikipedia page, and it is near October 11th, right? We can't make new old copies come into existence, right? And the idea is if I follow a link, I want to stay in that same temporal bubble. In this case, my target is still October 11th, And I found the closest local copy to that is actually September 15th, 2009. So I'm staying within Wikipedia, but I'm staying in that same historical perspective here. In this case, I'm going to follow a link outside of Wikipedia, right? And I still have my target of October 11th, 2009. In this case, I'm going to the robots.txt.org site, but I don't want the current version. I want whatever the old version is. And in this case, we're pulling a copy from, looks like the Internet Archive, and the closest date it has is when it was last modified, November 9th, 2007. So we have sort of a bouncing around in this point in time, but the idea is we want to view it as close as possible to this date. Now, this is a resource that obviously doesn't change that often, so perhaps the 2007 copy is good enough for our target of 2009. But it's not the current version, and that's the idea that we want to keep. So there's really two perspectives that we want to do, is figure out how we can have this navigation, this browsing, where we stay in or close or near the point in time that we want to navigate. The other thing is, how can we build an API so that we can build services around this that give us the past web? How can we merge all these archive holdings? All right, so looking at the first one, the idea is we have this current resource. We have the archived resources. They exist at different URIs. And the goal here is, how can I get from the original resource to the archived versions? All right. So what we're going to do is not just do an HTTP GET, but modify our HTTP GET with the date time that we want. And from this, we go through a magic cloud, not the cloud, of course, but we have to update our magic, I suppose, to arrive at the old versions, right? So obviously some intelligence has to occur here. So first thing, we need to briefly review one of the things that we are inspired by, which is called transparent content negotiation. How many people have heard of that? All right. How many people are afraid of it? It beat up your little brother or something like that. So if there were a webmaster talk, then content negotiation often gets you run out of the room because a lot of people don't really understand what it does and so forth. So the idea here is, typically, your browser is already doing this. This is the main thing. Your browser, if you look at your HTTP headers, it's sending its preferences for formats, languages, encodings, etc. So I do a GET on a resource. Frequently, there's only one variation on it. So I get it. I prefer HTML. I prefer English. That's what I get back. But there's actually sometimes there are additional versions available. So in case we have our English HTML, we have our English PDF, our French PDF. These are all essentially possible representations of this resource. So if I do a GET on this resource, the server is going to look at the preferences my client is passing in and then decide which one is the best available copy. In this case, it looked at the preferences, decided, even though I have 3 different versions that I can negotiate in 2 separate dimensions, I'm going to give you the English and the HTML version back. Now, in this case, I've reset my browser to say I prefer PDF and I prefer German. And really, I'm not going to accept anything else. If you don't have a German PDF, don't give it to me. So I pass that in, and the server responds saying, I understood your request. You want German PDF, but I can't give that to you. And then it actually passes back a list of the things that it does have to help you try and make a choice. That's what transparent content negotiation is. That's all that's involved. So the idea here is we want to do content negotiation, but in a 5th dimension, time. So the client can pass in what its preferences for time are. All right, so what we're going to do here is define some terminology. So we have this original resource. Those are always going to be the gray balls. And then we have mementos, the archived versions, the old versions, and those are going to be yellow balls in here. And the idea is, these are the versions that have been essentially snapshotted, stuck into an archive. They're the old versions in Wikipedia, what have you, right? These don't change. This is always the current version. All right. So as we saw in the previous header, we have previous slides, we have headers that specify my preferences for language, type, and so forth. And correspondingly, I always get back from the server saying, I know what you asked for, but this is what you got. And we're going to do the same thing in date time. So we have an accept date time header, and we have a content date time header. This is what I send in the request. I prefer this. And when I talk to the server, this is what I get back, saying this is what you actually got. All right. So there are sort of two models. One where this sort of the general model is the server cannot do its own archiving. This is, the Internet Archive or somebody else coming and crawling your website, and you're not really doing anything. The other model is you have a content management system like a wiki or Drupal or something like that that maintains prior copies. All right. So skipping straight ahead, this was an example that we ran with happy pictures of Herbert and myself and CNN and BBC rotating and so forth. So this is the current URL, and like twice a day we generate new copies. There's a transactional archive, so when a browser comes and views it, the server automatically pushes a copy. But that aspect's not really important. You could do this with a web crawler, a very aggressive web crawler coming through and making observations. So we have different versions, and each of these versions has a date time associated with it and a separate URI. And the goal is to get from here to one of these. All right, so we have the mementos, we have the original resource. What we introduce is a third kind of resource here. We call this a time gate. And because apparently one of the goals of this project was to incorporate as many sci-fi names as possible into, so we have time gates and time maps and so forth, and so we're well on our way so maybe we could be featured in the kinetics presentation next time. So the idea is this time gate is going to handle the negotiation to all of these. So these mementos exist in the archive. They don't really have their own intelligence. The magic, in this case, the blue cloud magic, is going to happen at the time gate. And we're going to introduce the time gate as the linkage between the current and the past. All right. So the idea is when I do a get on this, it actually provides a link to the time gate. And if the resource isn't compliant, then the client can sort of guess what a time gate would look like. This time gate has the logic to redirect us to the mementos. All right, so I've just explained time gate, so we have that. It's doing content negotiation in the previous 4 dimensions, but most importantly in the 5th dimension of time as well. All right, similarly with if we're inside of a wiki or any kind of other CMS, we have this URI, we have these with separate date stamps, separate URIs, etc. These are all on the same server, but we're going to use the same model. We're going to introduce this time gate. So this guy is not going to handle the content negotiation. This guy is just going to link to this guy, which still handles the content negotiation. So regardless of how your web server is set up, there's the same framework, same model that is propelling the whole transaction. All right. So let's look at a scenario. These are the people that give us money, so we'd like to feature them. And the idea is all of these memento, or all of these special kinds of resources are on separate servers. All right, so nothing helps digestion of lunch like looking at HTTP headers. That's what I believe, anyway. So this is the flow. We're going to step through it. The details aren't really important, but the idea is I probably should have updated that with an Explorer icon, right? No, okay, but we have a client. We'll let it go this time. Okay, this time, right? Next time, I promise. The icon in this case, it's doing a head. It could be a get. It doesn't matter. And the idea is it's passing in the request to the original resource. It adds a header in the request that says, I prefer this resource as it existed at this time. In this case, October 10th, 2009. The original resource responds, and in this case, if it's a head, I just get back the headers. If it was a get, I get back the entire body of the message, but the client could throw that away. What it's really looking for is this link header that says, according to this server, I'm recommending that you use this time gate. Now, this is one setup at experimental at NULL. We envision a future where there are multiple time gates, a competitive market for time gates, if you will, where they provide more coverage, better service, etc. There's no one true time gate is the idea. So the client receives this. It throws away any message that are a body that may have been sent, and it issues a get on the time gate and is again passing in the preferred date time. So that's what that looks like. We're talking to the time gate server at this point. Now, the magic happens here in this response. All right, there'll be tests on this. So what we're really getting is a 302 redirection. And in this location header, it's telling the client where to go based on the date time that we preferred. And then it passes back a lot of other cool stuff in the link header. So it's passing back the link to the time bundle, which is saying, I'm redirecting you to this version, but there's actually a whole bunch of other versions that are available. The time bundle is the collection of all those versions. But I'm also going to pass back a handful of other versions, and there'll be first, next, previous, last, etc. So I'm going to give you some shorthands here to help in navigation, but if you're really interested, because it can get very large, dereference the time bundle URI, and you'll get back to potentially thousands of different versions, and you can sort by date time. But the other thing that's important is I'm also sending back this original rel type as well. So this URI is a memento for this guy. So I can build up, as I'm pulling from different archives, that whatever these URIs might look like, they are standing for, they're mementos for the original version. All right. Then the client does a get on the memento URI that's passed back. That's the same. And then eventually I get back from the archive itself, I get back what that memento was. Now, the idea here is when I do this get, I don't have to be in, I can link to this, I can bookmark this. This guy doesn't change, right? He's essentially fixed in time. And we notate that with this content date time header, which is a little bit different than creation time. It's a little bit different than last modified time. Essentially what it's saying is the content that I'm going to send you is appropriate as of this date. You should assume it was first appeared or observed on the web, not necessarily first appeared, observed on the web at that date time. Now, it might have been modified later. You see those archive headers that tell you that you're in the archive and so forth. All of those things actually change the last modified date. And it's not necessarily the same thing as the creation date. It's a content date time. Sort of a new concept of time. It's kind of fuzzy, but it's sort of in between those two existing things. It also sends back these link headers, says I'm a memento for this original guy. Now that we're in a particular archive, it's sending back a time bundle, a first and a last and so forth. Because this archive doesn't know about all the other archives that exist, these values are actually slightly different than the link headers we got back from the time gate. Because the time gate is actually an aggregator. It knows about dozens of archives, merges their results. This archive only knows about itself, right? So you get sort of different values back. So this is the primary model that we have, okay? We have the original resource. It links to a time gate with this HTTP link header. Now, the idea is if the client is not memento aware, it gets, you create a link to this, it comes back in the response with this link header, the client's free to ignore it, the client is free to, even if it recognizes it, to substitute its own time gate URI. There's a lot of things that you can do, but the idea is we're creating a link from the original resource to the time gate. If you're memento aware and you choose to follow this link, you'll talk to the time gate, and based on the date time that you've passed in, it will 302 redirect you to whatever the appropriate memento is. If I follow a link to this time gate and I don't pass in a preferred date time, right now the recommended behavior is just to redirect you to the most recent copy that it has. So if you don't have a preference, it assumes that your preference is essentially last memento. The other thing is, if I'm here, I want these guys to provide a link back to the original resource. So the idea is I can put this in an email, I can bookmark this, what have you, and I'm at this memento, and it should be very clear, assuming that the client is memento aware, that I am actually an archive snapshot. This is not the current version. I'm looking at the past, and this version links back to the original URI in case I want to go here. Also, these versions link to each other, so I could do VCR playback of the web as it changes, etc. So the idea is, with this, hopefully we can launch really, I mean, we've all seen the nice demos, Zoetrope and so forth. The idea is we hope to really launch a set of nice user interfaces that can exploit this if there's a consistent framework underneath, right? Because we have no illusions. Nobody on this team is actually a really good user interface. So we're pretty happy with the blue ball, the yellow ball, et cetera, right? That's our extent. But the idea is, if this is in place and we get the various archives on board, then you can build really nice user interfaces that take advantage of this. Now, the idea, we have a whole bunch of stuff to get these archives on board. We're talking with the Internet Archive. They've promised native Memento support in the next version of Wayback, the next open source version of Wayback. We have a plugin for MediaWiki. We're talking with people at Wikipedia. We're hoping to get that on a sandbox version so that it has native supports. We're developing plugins for Drupal. There's all kinds of various archives and content management systems that the idea is we want to get native support into these archives so we can start to leverage all the mementos that are already out there. We do have a Mozilla plugin. You can go to the website and get redirected to it, and it's got a date slider so that when you're in CNN.com, you just move the date back to when you want to view the web, and it automatically does that, and you can turn it off by clicking the Memento icon, and you snap back to the future. So this is the primary model that we have, and this is our real contribution. Now, my favorite part is a recent conference paper we got back had one of the reviews came back, why would anyone want to look at obsolete web pages? So, I mean, just the choice of the word obsolete web page, right? Now, obviously, nobody in this room feels that way, or you'd be in another room, right? But we were actually sort of surprised at how much pushback there was and sort of submitting to general web conferences. Who wants to look at old things, right? And I could have chosen, half dozen of these other things, right? But this was my favorite. Who wants to look at obsolete data? And so this is the reason why I think we want to look at obsolete data. Because replaying the experience as it was observed or archived is ultimately more compelling. So again, I mentioned we always traffic in disasters. We need to come up with something better. But Hurricane Katrina 5 years ago, right? So I can go, this is a current representation of an overview page at CNN. And, it's got Mardi Gras and, your family stories. I mean, it sounds like a happy event, right? So I can go here and I can access whatever I need to know, right? That doesn't really get the picture, right? So we can look at the summary page, or we can replay from the archive the things that happen. So first, here it is brewing in the Gulf. And then people are leaving. But notice the font is still relatively small. Now things are getting serious. We have some missing images from the archive. Maybe they exist in other archives. Then things start to get serious. The font's bigger, people are starting to die, etc. I think this image really captures it nicely. This one. That's why we care about the past. That's far more convincing of replaying the experience, as terrible as it was, than looking at a summary overview page, a current representation, if you will. That's why we care about the past. I hope you can go to this URI and download the Memento Fox viewer and look at that. All right, thank you.
I think you'll agree with me, it's a fascinating project, and I'm sure there are going to be some questions. So if anyone has any questions for Michael.
Have you started showing this to social scientists, historians, sociologists? Because what you just showed is the kind of thing that they've always used newspapers in the past to be able to get that perception of the changing impression or the historic value of reporting at the time of the event. And have you started showing it to them and seeing what their response has been?
What's a newspaper? Sorry. Okay, apparently I found that funny. But all right. So this is where I have to admit my my own raging ignorance, right? So I only know a few social scientists. And actually, there's some at my university that would have been interested. So we submitted a proposal recently based on this, based on replaying this kind of information. And we forgot to include them. And that was my fault. Because basically, we're at the early stages of this. We're working on the technology focus. And we would have written a much stronger proposal if we had remembered to include the humanities scholars on this. But that's something we're planning to rectify in future versions. So we've only recently started to focus on this because we run into the people that say, why would you want to look at obsolete web pages? We just sort of forgot that was even a question that people would ask. So when people did ask us that question, we were completely disarmed. Because this work was sponsored by the Library of Congress. We go to them, explain it. We don't need to talk about why you want to look at the self-selection thing. Everyone who shows up at a brown bag like this, you don't need to convince them, right? It turns out you need to convince some of the people. So that's sort of our next phase, and that's really. So I'm doing the professor thing, just random talking. So one of the research topics that will make this far more usable, but it's infinitely far more difficult, is how do I convey in a meaningful manner how I'm looking at the past, right? Because essentially the current framework has so solidified our notions of I'm looking at the present, right? But even pages like this, and we had some pages where things are missing, right? But perhaps this image exists in a different archive. Well, that image might exist at the same URI, and maybe it's been changing at a different rate. So when I start pulling things in, there's a possibility I could recreate pages that never existed, right? So essentially, there has to be a probability distribution that says, we're pretty sure that this page actually existed. Even within the Internet Archive, all of the resources, these aren't crawled and collected at exactly the same time, right? So if the system that they're observing is changing as they're doing the crawl, then actually what they have might not have ever existed. So I'm viewing this page, but all of the embedded resources, collectively, they form this sort of temporal bubble. And how do I convey, here's the date of this resource, but of all of the resources and a page like this could be hundreds, right? All the style sheets and little spacer images and so forth. How do I meaningfully convey that we're pretty sure that what you're looking at is as it existed at the date time that it's claiming?
But that image will never change from what it is right now.
This image will not, not in this archive. Now, it's possible somebody else made another observation, and as we get more and more archives in, the problem becomes more pronounced, right? Assuming for the moment that everyone's telling the truth, right? Nobody's lying or no Byzantine errors in the archive. That's a whole separate problem. Assuming everyone's telling the truth and I reconstruct this page, I might actually, even if I hit this date directly on the button, all of this thing might span a month, 6 months, a year, based on, but that's even possible in the current web, right? If this page, this URI hasn't changed, its last modified date is some point way in the past. Well, in an archive, especially not a CMS, how do I know that I haven't missed an update if I tell you that this image should probably go with this date time, even though its last observed modification was 3 years ago? So I'm pretty sure it's right, but I can't guarantee it's right.
Question from John.
I was curious about the time gate. If it comes across it's in the interaction of the users browsing around in the past, you get to something that's outside the domain, if that's the right word, of the time gate, you can still pop out to the live web. Is that correct? And I have a follow-on question.
So essentially, what happens right now is, if you ask for a URI that is that actually has no archived representation, and you essentially get back a 406 response. So essentially, it won't give you something right as it's configured now. It won't give you something from the current web, the live web, and essentially says, I understood what you're looking for, but I don't have an archived copy that matches your request. Now, is that exactly the right behavior? Are there certain conditions where a current version is actually legitimate to have it sneak in, especially when you define the past to be like 5 minutes ago? Because all of these examples are sort of multi-year, so we sort of, the break with the current web is sort of obvious and clear, right? But if you define past to be very recent, then that boundary becomes fuzzy.
Right, and I'm taking no exception with that. I just know that it's tricky to design these interfaces to the archives, which we've done, where when are you in the archive, when have you left the archive, and it can be useful. It's
right, and especially
nice
when you start pulling from multiple archives. How do you convey that? Right.
So the follow-on question was then, if a time gate tends to know about one server or one CMS, do you have plans for federating, some kind of federation?
Right. So I didn't make this clear. So this is where I have to back up and say I had twice as many slides as this, and then based on some feedback with Herbert and so forth, decided that's way too many slides. No one's going to sit through all that. So I deleted them all. Now I wish I had them all because I blew through all the slides immediately. I got excited and just talked. So the idea is the time gate that we have, the ones that you saw on the slides, Memento Proxy, is an aggregator. It assembles time maps. Essentially, the idea is we generate time maps for each of these archives. So we have time maps for Internet Archive, Archive.it, half a dozen others that I can't think of off the top of my head. And the aggregator merges these time maps sorted by date time, right? So when you go to the aggregator, you get the representations of the archives that it knows about. But again, there's not one true aggregator, or not even one true time gate. So the idea is the time gate, in fact, has some intelligence built in. When it sees that you're looking for a Wikipedia URI, it actually will jump. We have a proxy defined for Wikipedia now. Wikipedia, by definition, will always have the canonical version, regardless of whether or not it exists in other archives, right? Wikipedia will have the most recent or the closest value. So it will essentially promote the Wikipedia values based on your request URI. So it has that kind of intelligence built into it. So again, we imagine multiple time gates. In fact, the earlier example we showed had a transactional archive, which by definition is going to be more up to date than any external archive. And the idea of why you even dereference the original URI to begin with, right? Because some people say, well, why ping R? Why even head R? Why don't you just, if you're browsing the past, why not go directly to the time gate? The idea is the original URI has something to tell us. And what it might do is inform us of a specialized time gate that might exist. Like if you have content squirreled away in a transactional archive, or any of these other specialized archives where you're pushing content, maybe I should go there instead of ask one of the general services like the Internet Archive. Maybe there's a better place where I should check. So we always recommend hitting the original resource because it might inform us of where to look. Now, in sort of the initial startup phase, typically that's not true, right? But as we play it out, we think that'll be true.
I have a question to see if this is something that could be applied here. It may be completely off, and that's fine. So here's my problem is that we run something called OER Commons, which is Open Education Resource Commons, and we're always looking for other resources that are alternatively licensed on the web. And so why we care about this time date stamp is because this could help us know, it helps us understand and research the remix issue. Now, if you're all on Wikipedia, then it's very easy to see versions, et cetera, but we're talking about, hundreds of different repositories, collections, and we want a way to be able to trace remix and reuse. And so I'm just wondering, as you're talking, the light bulbs are going off. I know it's at least analogous, and it might even be directly related.
Well, I think that would be appropriate, right? So one of the things that's not represented in this at all is we had a paper at the Linked Data Workshop and the web conference. And essentially, things with linked data, DBpedia and so forth, they're just sort of discovering, hey, maybe timestamps would be useful for all this data that we have. So we had a really nice demo that allowed you to essentially extract resources from DBpedia that were like GNP of various countries and so forth, and sort of replay them through time, right? I think you could do the same thing in the educational perspective, but in this case, you're sort of collecting them along some axis of rights or use or something like that. But if you have large collections of data and they change over time, then the Memento approach is obviously, I think, one that is applicable, because then you can sort of reconstruct or freeze, or especially if you're keeping old copies anyway, you might as well advertise or mark them as what they are, because they don't cease to be valuable. They're not really obsolete. They're just different, right?
Okay, I'm told that mine is the last question. It seems to me that the one of the really important contributions of this work is that it allows individual websites to start taking responsibility for their own archiving, rather than relying on one or two huge sites, and they can do that in an event-driven way, which is going to be much more efficient and more accurate than just sweeping through. Have you? What are you doing at this point to kind of encourage sites to manage their own archives? It seems to me there's some policy stuff, some operational guidance to webmasters. There's some software integration things. Could you speak to that side of this work a little more?
So I think right now it's primarily a function of awareness. Right, so it's going to depend on what audience we're talking to, right? So when we go to the Library of Congress and so forth, we don't need to instruct them. To them, we're really pushing. LANL has the transactional archive. Hope to release open source at some point, which I don't think there are any transactional archives that are open source. That's the way to really solve this problem. There are a lot of government entities that have this mandate to capture their material in a transactional archive. Especially once you get things like conditional puts solved, then you don't have to worry about overflowing your archive, right? Because actually that information changes very slowly. So that's clearly the way to go. The other thing that we run into in sort of the open web is sort of what the Internet Archive runs into. They think, oh my God, how do I opt out of this, right? I don't want this to occur. And then we have to explain that Memento is not an archive. It's a way to access all the other archives. And if you don't, there are things you can do if you don't want to be archived. What it does provide is a gradual way for organizations to buy into this. So Memento works even if you're not compliant. Right, so your website right now, I don't like archiving, I'm afraid of it, whatever. So my client talks to your website, it sees that you're not Memento aware, it throws away your response and intercepts it, throws it away, and starts talking to a time gate. You buy into it a little bit, and you start putting these link hitters. You're not actually running your own archive. Maybe you're aware that these external archives. Maybe you have a preference for who's actually doing your archive, so you can start doing the linking. Maybe you start having someone else archive for you, right? And you can essentially recommend or point, and up to the point of at some point doing your own archiving and pointing to that. So that's the path. Actually encouraging people. So we're talking primarily with linked data community at this point and the archiving library sort of community. So obviously the latter community understands the problems. Herbert's in Europe right now, generating a lot of interest at the various national libraries there. Europe's so far ahead of the U.S. in this realm, right? And then the last thing is trying to get the linked data people involved, right? Because they're going forward. And so the other thing is we're trying to get in the US, the data.gov, and the UK, their equivalent of data.gov that hopefully survived the election. Trying to get these people to say, just having permalinks to everything is not sufficient. You need actually a negotiable mechanism. So beyond those communities, that's why we have the sort of motivation slides of why you would want to look at obsolete data. So we're not as far along as we would like. In part because we never anticipated that would actually be a problem, but it is.
All right, well, I'm conscious of the fact that we all want to move on to our next sessions. I'm even more conscious of the fact that the people that have the room after us want to get in here and get set up. So please join me in thanking Michael for a fascinating presentation. And